It's important to remember that even though the United States had been attacked on December 7th, 1941 by the Japanese, and there was American sentiment that said, go after the Japanese, they were the ones who actually attacked us, the leaders of the Allies, FDR and Winston Churchill, said, no, no, no. The best approach is actually to go after Hitler in Europe. So that doesn't mean that there's not a pursuit of the Japanese and an ability to, or a desire to sort of take back land that the Japanese had taken after Hawaii, but there's going to be two different theaters, and sort of the greater emphasis is going to be on the European theater, at least as it relates to some of the major decisions and the majority of American troops. The major issue we're going to keep coming back to when we're dealing with the Allies is Joseph Stalin of the USSR asking Churchill and FDR to help him out. As we remember, the Nazis did try to invade the USSR, and despite the fact that the USSR had more troops and had a brutal winter, it's an ongoing fight, and the Soviets are losing, or will lose, millions and millions of troops. And so Stalin asks, will you please open up a Western front, a second front, to relieve the pressure? And at the first meeting that during the war that FDR and Churchill are going to have, Stalin is not at it, at Casablanca in Morocco, they actually decide against this second front. They decide to go sort of on the soft underbelly of Europe through Italy. Now, much of this goes back to Churchill's own experience in World War I with a battle at Gallipoli with an amphibious landing, and he's saying, we can't cross the English Channel right now from Britain to France. It would just be too costly. And they also throw down this idea of unconditional surrender, where Germany cannot surrender with any conditions. And this makes Germany more likely to fight until the end, which we are going to see. In addition, you're going to see later on a demand of an unconditional surrender of the Japanese coming out of Potsdam, which may ultimately beget or necessitate the dropping of the bomb. Now, the next time that the Allies are going to get together, the big three, as it's going to be because Stalin will join them, is in Tehran in Iran. And what we're going to see here is finally, in late 1943, a commitment to Operation Overlord, which most of us know as the D-Day invasion. And Stalin at this point gives an early indication that in return for opening up the second front, that he will enter the war in Japan after Germany surrenders. Now, the details of the D-Day invasion are, again, the stuff of legend, particularly the whole fake out of the fake army that Patton was supposedly going to lead and come to Calais in France. You really don't need to know the details of it, except for the fact that once it actually is successfully executed, you're going to see the march of the Allies through France, ultimately over the course of 1944, to Germany. And that, of course, is climactic in terms of leading up to what is known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Yet before VE Day in early May of 1945 can be celebrated, you're going to have one more conference that actually is focusing on what's going to happen in Europe. And in this case, you're going to see, again, the big three meeting for only the second time. And the next time they get together, FDR will be gone and Truman will take his place. But now they're talking about the post-war plan for Germany. And it's going to be decided that four countries, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, will each occupy one of four sectors. Now, in this Yalta conference, it's very important to understand that Stalin made a pledge that he would allow for free elections in Poland. Remember, Poland had been often invaded, had been actually invaded by the Soviet Union with Germany. But Stalin says, I will make sure that Poland will be free. Now, the fact that this does not happen and that a puppet government is set up by the USSR and that the Polish people really had no choice in the matter is going to be one of those signals that Stalin can't be trusted, which was a suspicion about Stalin the entire time. Now, after Yalta, which leads, through 45 to ultimately the German surrender, you're going to meet one more time. And this is going to be about 2 months after VE Day, and they're going to meet in Potsdam. So if you remember, you have the Atlantic Conference before the war, and then you're going to have Casablanca, and then you're going to have Tehran, and then you're going to have Yalta, and it finally finishes up with Potsdam. And here they really finalize what's going to happen in terms of post-war Germany, and now they're thinking about Japan. And they're going to demand that Japan surrender immediately with an allusion to the fact that the United States has a destructive force that they'll sort of rain down on Japan. They do not say that they have a bomb, which of course will make it so that when the first bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, it's really hard for the Japanese to believe, so hard in fact that many people didn't believe it happened, which leads to the lack of surrender, which leads to the bombing of Nagasaki. But just as we did in the lead up to war, we sort of need to take a few steps back and work our way to Japan. So obviously after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet is going to head out to try to get to Japan by working its way through many of the islands that Japan had taken. So of consequence really is the idea of the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. So this is 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, so it's actually quite recent. Midway Island is not far from Pearl Harbor, in relatively speaking, and what you're going to see there is really the importance of aircraft carriers. So you're not going to see boats actually in combat or ships in combat. You're going to see planes that fly off of these carriers. And this is really an advent or an innovation in wartime technology. And the Battle of Midway is important in terms of it sort of reverses the momentum. So Japan really had that momentum coming out of Pearl Harbor, and from 42 forward, even though it's going to be a slow march through many islands to get to first Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it is important to recognize this strategy of island hopping to try to avoid the Japanese as much as possible and keep the element of surprise. But even when you had to engage the Japanese on many of these islands, it proved to be very, very brutal, which gave the idea that if there ever was an attack on Japan itself, that it would lead to the loss of potentially millions of lives. Now, as was debated in class, this question of, should the bomb be dropped? Truman didn't even know about the existence of the bomb, which had been a major secret effort by the joined collaboration of British and American government and scientists. The question was, should we drop the bomb on industrial targets like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, really knocking them out and sending the message to the Japanese? Should it be not on civilians, but in a more rural area, just demonstrate the power but not kill as many people? Should it actually be out in the ocean to demonstrate the power but actually not do it on anyone altogether? And at the end of the day, when the bomb is dropped on Hiroshima and then days later on Nagasaki, the Japanese finally surrender, although they do actually want conditions on the surrender to allow their emperor to stay on the throne. So even though it was unconditional, going back to Potsdam, the United States did allow for that concession. And then just a little more than 2 months after VE Day, you're going to have VJ Day, and the war is officially over. Now, of course, the end of one war really starts the beginning of the Cold War, which the United States is not completely aware of at the time, but we know as a result of hindsight. Now, we're going to move backwards into the home front. Now, what's important to realize is, obviously, as the war is being fought from December of 41 all the way through VJ Day in mid-August of 1945, there's sacrifices being made at home. And we want to pay attention to the way the United States government is enforcing laws and restrictions, at the same time how certain groups are either benefiting or really being hurt during wartime. As we look at what the government is doing during World War II, it's important to realize that the war really does draw the United States out of the Great Depression. And you're going to see unemployment go almost to nothing. You're going to see income rise. You're going to see farm prices go up, and watch out what will happen after that war. But you're also going to see that as the government basically tells corporations to shift from a consumer-based economy to a wartime economy, you're going to have a real shortage of consumer goods, which, as you understand, supply and demand is going to increase demand, which will ultimately increase prices. But to sort of keep that inflation under control, the government is going to try to control those prices artificially, as well as encouraging Americans to save your money. Don't go out and buy stuff, save it, and then you'll be able to spend after the war is over. So when we look at the agencies that are brought in to keep prices under control and to avoid inflation, you have the Office of Price Administration, which is going to place ceilings on all prices. We saw in the propaganda video in class that you had to sort of pay with a ration book. You had only so much you could spend per month, and that you couldn't pay more than the listed price. Now, that's sort of affecting prices and consumers. In terms of production, you're going to see the War Production Board, which is doing way more than what we saw in World War I with what we saw as the War Industries Board. And this is going to really officially say, from the government to businesses, you have to do what we say. Now, this kind of sacrifice by businesses is, somewhat similar to what we saw during the New Deal, where businesses were told through the NIRA that you need to, create a minimum wage and maximum hours and maximum prices. In this case, it's actually more dictated than even what we saw with the NIRA. And so you have to give, certain materials that you would use otherwise to building of war. You're going to limit non-essential production, so everything is going to be focused on the war, and you're going to ration really important materials like gasoline, and metals, and rubber, and paper and plastic. Now, fighting a war is a major undertaking, as we've seen in the past, and like the government has done in almost every war, you're going to see bonds being sold, and that's where Americans essentially give a loan to the government, and in return, at the end of the war, they're going to get paid back with interest. In addition, as we actually saw during World War I, Americans are going to pay higher taxes to help fund this war. Now, what we want to look at in terms of labor is always sort of this question of, when times are good, labor does poorly, and in times are bad, labor does well. World War II is an odd one because you're coming out of an era where we saw, sort of the Magna Cartas of labor going back to Section 7A, which of course goes away in Schechter, but comes back as the National Labor Relations Act, this whole idea of collective bargaining, which leads to the leverage of the CIO and sit-down strikes. Now, the war is interesting because government will ask of labor to not strike, and in return, they are supposed to sort of get something as part of this quid pro quo. So you're going to see actually a huge increase in labor by about 30% during the war. And the federal government, in return for getting labor not to strike, will say, we're going to pay you more. Again, you have to essentially give a no strike pledge. In addition, the government made an important concession to labor that says basically anybody who's working in a defense plant can be in a union and automatically will be enrolled. And that, of course, helps membership go up, which more members, more leverage overall. The no-strike pledge was not exactly followed. As we saw by the Wobblies in World War I, you're going to see the United Mine Workers who, basically say, we're going to strike. We don't like what's going on. We don't care if it's at war. And you're going to see Congress, over FDR's veto, pass something called the Smith-Connolly Act, which is anti-labor. And it's going to say, union workers, you can't ever immediately strike. Okay, you have to wait a certain number of days. And it gives the president the ability to basically take over a plant where there are strikers. In some ways, drawing back a little bit to the 1902 coal strike with Teddy Roosevelt, where he basically said, we're going to force people back into the plants if you don't agree. Okay, so all in all, labor gains power in terms of members, gains more money, but is in some ways hamstrung by the no striking pledge. And then when people do strike, they're actually limited even more by the Smith-Connolly Act. I neglected to say the sort of famous name that you need to remember is John Lewis, he of the bushy eyebrows and he of the CIO. He also not only was the head of the CIO, but he also was the head of the United Mine Workers. And it is actually his strike, the coal strike, where the government basically says, how dare you, when we need coal to keep the country going, particularly during war, how dare you do this? So in many ways, labor became a bit of an enemy or unpatriotic if you looked at what the United Mine Workers and John Lewis and his bushy eyebrows were doing.